Hey guys, it's Mitch. How's it going? We've been into some cult classics recently with Strikeforce Morituri, DP7, and Alien Legion. I figured why not keep it going? We're taking a look at Micronauts #1 today. It's a little bit earlier than what we've been used to. This is a 1979 book instead of like a mid-80s book, but still very much in that bracket, I think. So we'll do just a little bit of history first. If you want to skip ahead to the comic, I left chapters in the description. You can jump ahead if you like. So the story of Micronauts is kind of a time-honored one now. I feel like we've heard this a couple of times, where a creator gets an idea stuck in their head about a toy line and they, craft a pitch, they take that to their editor and come up with a comic book series that is vaguely related, but kind of operates under its own steam. So in this case, of course, this comic was based on the Micronauts toy line, which was put out by Mego. It was based off of a Japanese toy called Microman and was released in the mid to late 70s. It did very well for Mego. And the writer of this book, Bill Mantlo, was taken with the Micronauts toys on a Christmas morning when his son was playing with them. You look at them now, they're kind of bulky, awkward, kind of typical 70s type toys. But they did have a neat feature in that all of their limbs were removable. They were all attached by these pins and they were completely interchangeable. They all had the exact same pin system. So you could take the arms off of one guy, stick them on, I suppose, the hips of another guy, so he's got arm legs. Or the other way around, you can make a guy where all of his limbs are legs, and you could call him the Kickler. And I mean, this would have been, like 1978 probably. And at that time, Star Wars is on everybody's mind. So Bill Mantlo was looking at these toys and he started thinking space opera. And he came up with this epic concept, put together a pitch and took that to his editor, Jim Shooter, asking Jim to go and purchase the license for Micronauts. I think Shooter was probably a little bit reticent at the time because Marvel hadn't really been dabbling too much in toy licensed comics just yet. They'd tried a little bit before this with Shogun Warriors. That didn't go very well because there wasn't any real kind of story there. It was based again on Japanese like robot toys, and it turned into a monster of the week kind of comic. And without a story driving it, it didn't really end up going anywhere. But with Mantlo's idea of turning this into, the rebellion versus the Empire, we're crossing different planes of reality. There's all sorts of neat ideas in this thing. I imagine Jim Shooter's like, okay, yeah, sure. At least we've got that fundamental thing that we didn't have with Shogun Warriors. So he went ahead and they got the license. And Bill Mantlo was a good guy for this particular project. He'd established himself at Marvel largely as like a fix-it guy. He was a dude who could come in and produce a solid, reasonably creative script on very short notice. So you look at his bibliography in the 70s and he's on everything. He had also gotten some long runs in on Spectacular Spider-Man, on The Champions, on Iron Man, and The Human Fly. After this series, though, he would make more of a name for himself, getting extended runs on Incredible Hulk and on Rom's Space Knight. For the art duties, they tapped a guy who hadn't had a whole lot of experience in the business just yet, some fresh-faced kid named Michael Golden. Michael Golden had gotten his start in commercial art before moving to DC, getting a little bit of work on Batman Family and Mr. Miracle. He'd already shown an incredible amount of ability. I think he was also starting to already get a little bit of a reputation for taking too long on pages. Because Michael Golden, of course, has an incredibly detailed style, and he's the kind of guy who will just sit on a page and noodle forever. And if an editor isn't on his back constantly, he will just take way too goddamn long finishing up an issue. Which is one of the reasons why there are very few Michael Golden comics out there, considering how long he's been in the industry. So with the story all prepared, with the creative team in place, they were ready to go ahead. And Micronauts would end up being kind of a cult hit. Based, I think, largely on the first 12 issues, which are the 12 issues that were drawn by Michael Golden. Bill Mantlo would stay on the series until the second last issue, issue 58. But yeah, Michael Golden only lasted till issue 12, and then there was a revolving cast of artists, some of them pretty good. There's a couple issues by Howard Chaykin, there's a few by Keith Giffen, Gil Kane's in there, as well as, I think, a longer run by Butch Guice. So at the very least, you were going to get solid creators on this book. So I think that's probably enough backstory for now. Really, you didn't need a whole lot. So why don't we get into it here? We can start with the cover. So this is not a Michael Golden cover. Let's start with the obvious. This is a Dave Cockrum cover, inked by Al Milgrom. It's a pretty good cover. It's a little bit standard for 70s Marvel, particularly, I suppose, with a licensed property. Got some very nice elements, though. We've got our low angle with all our heroes in front kind of leaping toward us. Get the equivalent of speed lines from the 70s with the kind of flash here. We also get our looming villain in the back, Baron Garza. That's actually a very nice element. I'm pretty sure that was taken from the original concept for the cover that was drawn up by Michael Golden. So I'll put that up here. The reason that this didn't become the cover to Micronauts #1 is because as a fairly young cartoonist, he didn't realize he had to leave room at the top for the title font. So, I mean, it's a pretty good looking cover, but it's completely unusable, really. It does feel much more like a book illustration than specifically a comic book cover. I mean, you look at it and this looks like it would be something out of a fairy tale book. I mean, which makes perfect sense considering where Michael Golden was coming from. You know, he was a commercial illustrator. This cover here kind of shifts everything down a little bit. You know, Dave Cockrum at this time, he's a seasoned pro. There's kind of a Gil Kane feeling to some of these figures here, which I kind of dig. I mean, overall, the presentation is actually pretty nice, and it's definitely like eye-grabbing on the rack, I would imagine. I should note, of course, that this is the facsimile edition. I don't have a copy of Micronauts #1. And now looking at mycomicshop.com, I'm not sure why I don't. The prices aren't that much. Oh well. I think I was on a facsimile binge when I got this one. But yeah, very good cover, very nice composition. The style isn't quite to my liking, but then I've never really been a Dave Cockrum fan, so that's basically what you can sum that up as, I think. So we're going to start things off, and I'm going to say that things get confusing right away, at least for me. I didn't read Micronauts back in the day. It's just a little bit before my time. There's a 1979 comic. I wouldn't really been aware of comics until like 1984, 85, I think. So I don't come into this with a deep knowledge of where Micronauts would go from here. So just looking at this as, you know, this is sort of a fresh look, it's a little odd when you jump in and, you know, we've got dudes on horseback and they're fleeing from what appears to be sci-fi raiders. So we've got Prince Argon and his sister, Princess Marie, and they're fleeing from the evil rebels, the Acro Years. It's a nice little splash to start things off with here. You know, you can tell just by the shapes of the buildings and, you know, the mix of kind of what already feels a little bit like high fantasy with some sci-fi, that this is probably an alien world. So on that front, at least, I think it's fairly straightforward. And we also get our credits up here. So Bill Mantlo, the writer, Michael Golden, the artist, storytellers as well. They both get that credit. And then Joseph Rubinstein getting the embellisher credit, not inker. So because Michael Golden was young and he was very slow, his editors were cracking on him constantly. So he really had to whip off these pages to the point where it doesn't sound like, in some cases, there was a whole lot on them at all, where it would mostly just be kind of the anatomy of the figures and maybe no background. And he'd leave it up to Joseph Rubinstein to fill in tech. And we're going to see a lot of examples of Joseph Rubinstein pulling out some very interesting references over the course of this comic. We've also got the editors, Al Milgrom and Jim Shooter, of course, editor-in-chief, and letters by Tom Orzechowski and colorist Glynis Wein. So an interesting mix here, talented people. What I would imagine for a few of them is probably pretty early in their career. And that might actually be kind of an important factor because, of course, this is a licensed product. And at the time, licensed products weren't viewed as something that, you know, an industry professional really wanted to latch on to. So none of the big names wanted anything to do with this book. You know, both Orzechowski and Wein/Oliver, they'd only been in the business like 4 or 5 years at this point. So you get a bunch of guys who are kind of, you know, like young talents. With Bill Mantlo, who's a dude who's proven that, like a steady hand on the tiller, you put an experienced editor in Al Milgrom in charge of the book, which is the reason he was the one doing the inks on the last-minute cover. Joseph Rubinstein hadn't been in the business much longer, but he had established himself as a guy who could get work done quickly and was also a bit of a chameleon. Also didn't really like to have like a house-style look, which is interesting in the Jim Shooter era, because if there's one thing Jim Shooter seems to love, it's a house style. So yeah, interesting mix of raw talent and like veteran babysitters almost, really. So the Acro Years are tearing through the city, and the ruling party are having to run for their lives. The Acro Years themselves are agents of Baron Karza, who is the evil Darth Vader-looking dude off the cover. I mean, the look was based off of the toy that had been established before Star Wars came out, I think. But then when the comic was being developed, I think they tried to move a little bit more in a Darth Vader direction. And, you know, all sorts of exclamation points. Everybody speaks in exclamation points all the time. It's the 70s. It was the style at the time. And there's some fun stuff going on with the art in this. Going with a negative space, no panel border shot for the close-up on this structure here with all sorts of the royals reacting to the raid. The actual combat in the streets gets much looser, which I'm sure Michael Golden was not happy with. I don't think he much enjoyed working with Joseph Rubinstein, but then again, he didn't have time to provide tight enough pencils to really get the results he was looking for, I think. So when we get stuff like the elite is trying to ride through the town on horseback and getting shot down by the acro-ears, the riders are all going to get silhouetted here. I think probably because Michael Golden left them as like a very loose outline. And Joseph Rubinstein probably didn't have time to go and actually just sketch in the figures. You know, this stuff, it looks much more like Michael Golden probably put the effort in to finish this up a little bit. And because Joseph Rubinstein's using a lot of brushwork on this, I think it tends to get very loose. Like it kind of evokes like Harvey Kurtzman or something. I'm thinking of like his EC War comics. There's a little bit of that here and there. I also get little bits of like Hal Foster Prince Valiant. You know, like with stuff like this here, where the prince and princess are being led through like the Undercity to try and escape from the attackers. That's more in the layout, so maybe that's something more that Michael Golden's thinking than Joseph Rubinstein. But it's a weird mix. So we've got the ruling party here, and they're all meeting. They're trying to figure out how to escape. Prince Argon summons a time traveler, who was one of the original toys, and he's going to show them the way out. Yeah, these faces look much more like tightly penciled Michael Golden type faces. It's some nice stuff, but you can also still see how fast Joe Rubinstein is going with the brush in here. And then nice effect, actually, by going in after it's inked and I think dragging a razor across the ink. I remember hearing that in a Cartoonist Kayfabe video. I'm not sure if that would have been Rubinstein or Golden, but it was suggested that Golden went in after the fact and kind of oversaw production, so that might have been him with the razor blade. So then we get back to outside where the acro-ears are setting up gun emplacements to surround the shelter that the royal family have barricaded themselves in. And they bombard it, they kind of knock down the walls. And it looks like Argon is killed outright in a blast here. Great looking shot. With a little blood splatter and everything in here. Like for a comic that's based off of a kid's toy, that's a little surprising to see really in this. But I mean, Micronauts would eventually get to be pretty dark from what I understand. I mean, like, the seeds of that would be sown in this first issue here, as we get Baron Karza entering into the carnage. Baron Karza's whole thing is that he's promised that everybody who serves him is going to have immortality due to the magic of the body banks. But the secret of the body banks is basically that poor people go into the body banks, and then the elite use the life force of those poor people to get that immortality. I believe they also do, like, replacement of limbs and stuff, which ties back into the toys. But yeah, I love this shot here of the prince dying on the floor. There's such great shadow work there. Oh, there's going to be a lot of ads in this. All right, so now we're on to Chapter 2, Homecoming. Chapter 1 was Homeworld, where we get a great shot to start off with, like a really low Dutch angle with this spaceship swooping in. Like, cool-looking ship, nice-looking textures. There's all sorts of good shit going on there. So this is the ship of Arcturus Ran, and Arcturus is returning home after being in the microverse for 1,000 years in cryogenic sleep. I believe the deal is that he was telepathically hooked up to his ship, so he was able to still be awake and operate everything through the ship. Which is an interesting little detail, if I interpreted that right. Again, it's a little confusing sometimes. Like, backstory elements kind of get thrown at you fast and furious, and the pace of the book is kind of fast. So you do end up just kind of moving through it real quick and hoping that the background details and the names and everything, like, some of it'll stick. Or at least I do anyway. That's kind of how I read this. So Rand lands his ship and, gets off and he's expecting like a hero's welcome. He's been gone for 1,000 years, right? Only when he arrives, there is a company of guards to greet him, but they, brandish their weapons at his arrival. Nice shot here too. Again, no, with a negative space, no panel border, kind of freezing the moment in time. Michael Golden is having to go fast because none of these guns have any detail on them. If Michael Golden had the time to do this the way he wanted to, there would have been all sorts of detail. Like, that would have been photorealistic. So apparently it's been determined that Arcturus Ran is kind of an X factor. I think these are the troops of Baron Karza. So, he tries to quickly run back onto the ship. They open fire, and I guess it gets kind of a concussion blast that knocks him out for a second. So they take him captive, and they say here, cordon off his ship, throw this scum in a cell. Yeah, it says, it shall be as you say, Baron Karza. So that's Karza speaking. And he says, good, another X factor has been eliminated. And we're going to find out later on that Baron Karza actually knows Arcturus Ran. They were friends 1,000 years ago. Rand's been keeping himself alive through cryogenic sleep. Karza's been keeping himself alive by feeding off of the life essence of the poor. Again, kind of dark, really, for a book based off of a kid's toy line. But I mean, when they came up with the book, there was nothing to go on, right? There was absolutely no story attached to the Micronauts. They were just, little plastic figures. So, I mean, Bill Mantlo was kind of free to come up with what he wanted, and comic book adaptations of toys wasn't really something that was done very often at the time. This would be the book that would basically be the gateway to Marvel deciding to start licensing more and more toys. So that would lead to G.I. Joe, Transformers, all that stuff. But at the time this was coming out, the comic book adaptations weren't a regular thing, so I don't think the toy company really had too much oversight into what the content of the comic was. They probably didn't care. The toys themselves had kind of run their course. They were successful for a while, and they were starting to peter out a little bit. So anything they get from the comics is just like, okay, well, that's just good business. So Arcturus Rand gets thrown into a cell, and he wakes up surrounded by aliens. Again, some interesting stuff going on, because I looked at this, and I mean, my first thought was, that looks like a Kelly Jones panel. But of course, it's not Kelly Jones, because Kelly Jones, isn't really in comics yet, not in 1979. Yeah, no, he's 17 years old. He's just finishing up high school. Funnily enough, Kelly Jones's first work would come on Micronauts, 4 or 5 years later. But I mean, since this is very obviously not Kelly Jones, you got to go a little further back. So it's so that looks like Bernie Wrightson that's being referenced there. I wasn't sure about it at first, and then, you turn the page. Well, you get a whole bunch of ads when you turn the page, including a whole bunch. This is all Star Wars ads. You got to love these 70s ads where it's all just drawn. There's no photos or anything. There's no composing elements. It's just, you hand it off to an illustrator and go, okay, come up with an ad for this. But anyway, yeah, I was talking about the Bernie Wrightson look. Again, you see it with some of the figure work here. Some of this rendering is, it's a very light kind of version of Bernie Wrightson. Obviously, he'd go far heavier on detail, at least back in his heyday. But that is kind of the look that he's going for here. Really just with Arcturus Rand, I think. And an interesting effect you get, actually, is that when you get Joe Rubinstein kind of mimicking Bernie Wrightson lines, but, having to do it in a pretty quick kind of fashion, you kind of get Sam Keith in a lot of ways here. When Sam Keith's doing a bit more of a cartoony style. Obviously, Sam Keith had the same kind of influences where he was, heavily influenced by Bernie Wrightson, him and Kelly Jones both. But it's just kind of interesting to see, you take cartoony and you throw Bernie Wrightson textures on top of it. It's like, oh yeah, that's Sam Keith, right. So anyway, Arcturus Rand, yeah, he's gotten surrounded by these aliens, and naturally he's fresh meat in the pen, right? So they're talking about they're going to cook him up for dinner, when all of a sudden he gets scooped up by somebody, and then somebody else knocks back all of his assailants. So these are guys who will eventually end up as Micronauts. This is Bug, and this is Acroyear, who is Prince of the Acroyears. Now I don't feel so bad naming my alien diplomat Maxtremus and saying she comes from the homeworld of Maxstream, which is populated by Maxtretians. But yeah, Arcturus Rand has been rescued by a couple of fellow inmates. Acroyear himself is interesting because he's got personal ties to Baron Karza, as, does Rand himself, of course. And he seems to have, super strength and shit. And Bug sets Rand back down. I did recognize his speech pattern, so I guess I must have had a Micronauts comic or two when I was a kid. I did not recognize seeing Bug take his helmet off. That was just flat out disturbing. But they're going to kind of fill Rand in a little bit on what's been going on, that Baron Karza's in control, and that he's taking over worlds and slaughtering their inhabitants. And Rand here says, Baron Karza? You mean Dr. Karza of the Science Academy? But he was my professor 1,000 years ago. So that's the connection there. But we are getting our team together pretty quickly here, really. We've gotten a nice little group forming up here, and we're going to add to it here, as they can look outside through the window, through the bars naturally, and there's what appears to be a robot girl, and she's dancing to entertain spectators. And, the costume's going to be recognizable from what we saw earlier. This is Mary, or Marie, and she's got her little robot assistant from earlier. Yeah, that guy there. And that was Microtron. So they're acting as a duo where he's treating her like a marionette. She's pretending to be a robot dancer because basically she's in disguise. I guess she was able to get away from Baron Karza when he infiltrated the shelter, and they've been just trying to get off planet, I suppose, get out of the system. I don't know exactly. So now we're going to get to Chapter 3, Escape. And this is the deal where all of the prisoners get thrown into the gladiator arena. Mary, or Marionette, gets taken out of the display area where she was, and she actually gets thrown in with the other prisoners, so that's not going to work out too well for her. And Baron Karza orders the death tank to get brought in. And we get this giant friggin' robot with the big spiky wheels. Looks very much like kind of a toned down version of what Michael Golden would be doing later on in like G.I. Joe Yearbook #2. But fun shot here. And again, you can see, Joseph Rubenstein's having to simplify all the figures down here because I don't think he had a whole lot to work with there. Even like all these figures here where we get these shots of like Baron Karza and his Acro Year advisor, it feels like a boiled down version of what Michael Golden would have put on the page. Even the close up here of Baron Karza, it feels kind of rough. We're getting like big blocks of black. It's interesting stuff. Oh, and then we get, first we get another hand-drawn ad, this time for Jaws 2. Oh, this is a movie adaptation of Jaws 2. Oh, geez, I didn't even catch that at first. By Gene Colan and Tom Palmer with Rick Marshall writing, I suppose. And includes an exclusive interview with Jaws 2 director Jeannot Swark. You guys all know Jeannot Swark, right? Well, now you know he directed Jaws 2. So here in the middle, we're going to get some file card stuff where all of the characters that we've met so far, because we finally met everybody, now they're going to get explained to us. So we get the breakdowns for Arcturus Rand, for Marionette, Bug, Acro Year, Prince Shaitan, that's the advisor, and Baron Karza. See, you look at this treatment here was done by Michael Golden on his own. You see the kind of detail he puts on Baron Karza when he has a little time to do his own element. And this is what it's meant to look like. Versus that there, which is, kind of a rough approximation. You get the big close-up on Bug here. It looks, again, a fair bit more detailed than what Joseph Rubenstein was able to pull out here. This almost looks like Neil Adams. We also get Biotron, who we haven't met yet, but we will later on, Microtron, and the Shadow Priests. We saw a little bit of those right here. What's the deal with the Shadow Priests? Having first appeared on Homeworld. Homeworld is, I don't probably need to explain, the Homeworld. Having first appeared on Homeworld 1,000 years ago, they had assured Karza that their religion would aid his science in capturing the hearts and minds of the microverse. Unsure of himself then, Karza had agreed, thinking the priests could be dealt with at the proper moment. Yet 1,000 years later, that moment still hasn't come. And Karza himself, contemptuous of a force he considers inferior to his own science, cannot understand why. And then there's the time traveler, about whom we're not saying anything just yet. Okay. So this is helpful because we've had a whole lot of characters thrown at us. And again, the pace has been pretty high. We haven't had a whole lot of time to sit with just about anybody, really. So to just kind of pause in the middle of the book here and go, by the way, all these guys we've been showing you, this is who these guys are. That is actually helpful. It's more helpful than having it at the beginning or at the end of the book, really. I'd never seen that before, but it was actually kind of a relief when it did pop up in the book. And yeah, it's actually kind of a smart element because if you put all the character stuff right at the beginning of the book, nobody cares. I don't know who any of these people are. Why are you giving me all this information that I got to try and remember through the book? And, you go flipping through the book and then you got to flip back to the beginning and it's like, it's a pain in the ass. If you put it at the end of the book, then the reader's just kind of lost throughout or they're trying to keep up. And then you get to the end and it's like, well, now you tell me I could have used this thing like 15 pages ago. You put it right in the middle, right when we've kind of introduced the last of the main cast. And, now we're kind of throwing everybody together and we're going to move the story forward. That is kind of ideal, actually. I'm a little surprised I haven't seen that before now. I wouldn't expect it to work. Like, you'd figure that'd be an annoyance or something, but it does actually kind of work in the book's favor. So we're going to get all our heroes versus, what was it, the Death Tank? It was the Death Tank. All right. God bless the 70s. And there's a bunch of cannon fodder, so probably a lot of those aliens that were assaulting Rand right at the beginning of his stay there, they get kind of thrown to the front. They get annihilated immediately. Acro Year and Bug are going to try and keep Rand out of the line of fire because they've figured out that Rand is that X factor that Baron Karza is afraid of. So it would seem that he's been thrown in here because Karza wants Rand eliminated in the gladiatorial arena. Like he's taking some pleasure from that. Acro Year and Bug are going to try and keep him aside so that they can basically use Rand against Karza. So Bug starts out by flying up and he's got himself a little bit of, I don't know where he get the bomb from. He's got a bomb though, and he throws it inside the Death Tank here, which immediately incapacitates it. The advisor here doesn't like it. He's like, wait a minute, they're escaping. And Karza says that this is the plan, apparently. He's okay with allowing Rand to team up with Acro Year and Bug and to try and escape from the gladiatorial arena. Which seems odd, really. It kind of seems like he's trying to form the Micronauts. Having not read any more issues of Micronauts, I assume there's some kind of plan there, but I have no idea what it would be. So with the death tank kind of incapacitated, Acroyear is going to come up and he's going to finish it off. Rand's off to the side when he gets kind of turned around by Time Traveler. That was the name of the toy, too, yeah. And Time Traveler's going to advise him on how to escape. Again, we get kind of a Bernie Wrightson look here with some of these very thin lines that I think are being done with a brush. It doesn't show up that often, but every once in a while you get kind of struck by it. So then a series of explosions go off. So Bug and Acroyear have apparently been working together for a little while, and they've managed to rig the place up with all sorts of demolitions. Not sure how. Again, not sure where they would have got those, but that's what they did. And, I mean, they're blowing up everything. They're blowing up spectators. You can see bodies flying and all that. Karza isn't concerned, even if his advisor is, because he says here, as long as a cell remains intact, I can reconstruct a lot of them. And they'll sing my praises to their shadow priests. So with the death tank disabled, the Acroyears, which the advisor is in charge of, I believe Acroyear himself is this guy's brother, and I think probably he deposed him. I don't think that was stated outright in the comic. So with the Acroyears descending on them, they escape from the arena, I guess, with Acroyear, I suppose, punching his way out. It's a little hard to tell. I think this might be down to Michael Golden. This is the thing. I mean, there are parts in here that are unclear, and I'm not sure how much of it is down to Michael Golden hasn't quite figured out storytelling just yet. I think that's probably a factor. On their way out, they scoop up Marionette and her Microtron, and they're able to find their way to a transport of some kind. Is it the ship itself? Hard to say. Acroyear's going to hold off the Acroyears while they get on board, and Marionette here is telling them to get on, and she's invoking Delane and Sepsis. They've been talking about Delane and Sepsis all the way through here. And this is very obviously like deities, and that catches Arcturus Ran off guard because those are the names of his parents. Again, weird little detail to throw in there. So, okay, yeah, no, they hadn't made it to the ship just yet because they're doing that here. Fair enough. Nice shot, too, with them on the steps to what I assume is the hangar, with, again, Acroyear trying to hold off any pursuers. Karza, again, is letting them go because he says there's some kind of unknown at work here. Since he's a scientist, he wants information. So he's going to let it play out and see what happens, and figures that whatever happens, he'll be able to handle it. They do manage to make their way on board Arcturus Ran's ship, where they meet Biotron, who looks very much like a giant 70s toy. And they're able to lift off and take off for space with a bunch of thorium orbiters on their tail. So we get just the one panel of a space battle here. Again, we're kind of evoking Star Wars a little bit. We get the awesome close-up on Arcturus Ran, very dramatically lit, looks fantastic. Nice contrast too with the, the difference between the magenta and the desaturated blue. That's kind of awesome. So to escape, they're going to try to make their way through the space wall, which marks the fringes of the microverse, so I guess that's the edge of the known universe to them, basically. And 6 fugitives breach the fabric of space and streak at faster than light speeds towards Earth. Don't dare miss our second senses-shattering issue. And that is the end of issue 1. Yeah, there was, I don't know. I gotta say, it's not really my thing. I'm trying to pin down exactly what it is. Part of it is that there's a lot of information thrown at you, and then they don't give you time to digest any of it. Or it's thrown out in the middle of action, or just like a random line of dialogue that isn't referenced back to. As long as Bill Mantlo has all this in his head, I think that's probably okay. The case is high enough that I think most kids might have picked up issue 2 anyway. And the art's pretty good. It's not as good as Michael Golden could do, even at this time. But again, I think that's down to how little time Michael Golden had. And Joseph Rubinstein having to kind of make things up on the fly. With some interesting results here and there. It doesn't always work, but every once in a while it really does. So from here, the Micronauts are going to make their way to Earth. And there's an interesting side effect in that when they make their way through the space wall, which is, some kind of space-time barrier, they get shrunk down further. So they're actually the size of their toys. They're about, they're the 3.75-inch G.I. Joe size toys. Which is, again, kind of a neat idea. And actually really good for kind of establishing a rapport with the reader. Like a pretty young kid. So, you pick up a comic featuring your toy, and it has those characters in the comic being the size of your toy. It's kind of a neat idea, really. And from here, Micronauts, again, would be pretty successful anyway, but not so much on the newsstand, at least not long term. More in the direct market. So, the way the newsstand worked was on the returnable policies. So, theoretically, if a convenience store orders 10 copies of Micronauts #1, and they only sell 4, they can rip off the covers and send back the other 6 for a refund. And Micronauts, unfortunately, was one of those books where the returns were outweighing the sales. Again, at least on the newsstand. In the direct market, the copies that were going to the comic book stores, those were selling out, as hardcore fans got hooked into the epic space opera story that was going on. So what Marvel decided to do, and what turned out to be kind of a breakthrough move, actually, was to make Micronauts a direct market only comic, and this was like the first time they'd done that, really. They took Micronauts and Moon Knight and Kazar and Dazzler. All those were kind of in the same boat, so they moved those to direct market only, where they were doing much healthier. And of course, the orders on those books were much smaller, but they were also guaranteed through the non-returnable policy. And Micronauts itself did all right. It went up until issue 58, with Bill Mantlo writing every single issue. At 58, he decided that he was he'd kind of said everything he wanted to say with Micronauts. He did everything he wanted to do with that story. So he wrapped up all the major plot points. And then issue 59 is the last issue of volume 1. That was written by Peter B. Gillis, who actually went on to write Strike Force Morituri a few years later. Before that, he would be the writer on volume 2 of Micronauts, and that was the New Voyages. And Micronauts would pop up every once in a while they keep popping up, really. An interesting aspect of the Micronauts is that they weren't given their own separate universe. They were actually incorporated into the Marvel universe. So as soon as they crossed over into that, you could have them guest star in other series, and then they're just kind of part of the universe at large. You can bring them back at any time, and they're now a time-honored part of Marvel tradition. In terms of the creators, Michael Golden, of course, would go on to become one of the most revered pencilers, really, in the history of modern comics. Just massively influential, particularly like the Image guys. Jim Lee has said that when he was working at Marvel, he had a rapidly growing Michael Golden original art collection. And you only have to look at Todd McFarlane's work for a second to see the Michael Golden influence all over that shit. And for Bill Mantlo, unfortunately, things went very different. In the early 90s, he actually decided he was done with comics for a while and he was going to become a lawyer. But in 1992, he was the victim of a hit and run, and it actually put him in a coma for a short time. And when he woke up, it turned out the accident had given him very serious brain damage, to the point where he has difficulties with cognitive function. He doesn't speak very much. He's kind of immobile. And he requires constant care. And he was getting that constant care from his brother, who it sounds like just about bankrupted himself trying to look after Bill, up until the mid-2000s when Marvel actually did write by Bill Mantlo, which is nice to hear. Because during the 70s and 80s, Bill Mantlo naturally created all sorts of characters. A few of those characters went on to provide him with quite a few royalties, because they were created during the era when Jim Shooter was the editor-in-chief, and he instituted those royalties for creators. So some of these creations would have been like Cloak and Dagger. He was co-creator on those. They get featured fairly often. They also had a mini-series eventually, and there were royalties attached to that. The more important character he created, though, was Rocket Raccoon. And of course, when Guardians of the Galaxy included that character, that movie just blew the fuck up. And Marvel confirmed Bill Mantlo was full co-creator, so he was entitled to all the royalties deserved under that credit. So Bill Mantlo, at least, is set up financially for the rest of his life by the sound of it. So that's something. Kind of a horrifying end, unfortunately. I wasn't aware what had happened to Bill Mantlo, and it's like, okay, he's still alive, but then you find out, it's like, oh shit, that's fucking awful. But at least it's not at the point where his brother is trying to bankrupt himself to try and keep Bill cared for anymore. So it's not a particularly uplifting ending, unfortunately, but that is the reality of the series. And I'm not too sure where to go from there, so I guess we'll probably just end it. But let me know in the comments what you think of Micronauts. I know there's a huge Micronauts fan base out there. The impression that I get is that those first 12 issues are held in very high regard, and after that it seems to be kind of mixed reviews. Some people are still very much on board until the end of the series. Some people think that's as good as it got, and it never really got anywhere near as good as that again. So yeah, if you were a Micronauts reader, let me know in the comments. But for this one, that is going to do it. So thanks very much for watching, guys. If you got this far, don't forget to hit like, hit subscribe if you haven't already. And right about now, you should be seeing a link for my Patreon. You can go check that out too if you want. But yeah, that's going to do it. Thanks again for watching, guys. I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.